Welcome to another edition of Around the Table with Stacy Smith. We're talking about politics. The Pennsylvania primary is over, almost. As far as Pittsburgh and Pennsylvania, there are two races that are going now to apparently a recount. So let's talk about that with our guests, and they are an astute group of political analysts, and I'm going to introduce them to you right now. We are joined by former governor of Pennsylvania, Republican Tom Corbett. He was also the state attorney general and the U.S. attorney for the Western District of Pennsylvania. Mr. Corbett teaches law at Duquesne University and also practices law. Around the table, we find Jim Byrne, the former chairman of the Democratic Party in the state of Pennsylvania. Jim also served as president of Allegheny County Council and mayor of Millvale. Jim is also an attorney in town. We go back around the table. He's not an attorney, but he's well known. Keith Schmidt. Keith's background is in politics. He goes back to the Reagan presidency, and he was also the state director for former Republican Senator Rick Santorum. Keith was also a consultant to Santorum's presidential campaign in 2012. Keith has his own consulting firm. And seated across the table on the Democratic side is someone who I like to call the great philosopher of Around the Table, Joe Mystic. Joe is a guiding light for a lot of Democrats and has consulted on campaigns across the state. He also served in several roles in city government, including that of deputy mayor. Joe teaches law at Duquesne University, and you can read his thoughts on politics and life in the Trib. Gentlemen, thanks so much for being with us once again. Boy, what a primary we had yesterday. So where do we begin? Let's start with this one, the governor's race. Mastriano, how did he surge to capture it so easily? Anybody, jump in and talk.
I think that's the big story of this primary. He just went straight ahead and took it. He took it with about 30% of the vote, I guess. I'm not sure what the final number is, but he ran against everybody in his own style and manner, and I think that he's the he's the example of the best run campaign so far, and he didn't have any money to speak of.
It seems to me that the GOP will have somewhat of an uphill battle taking back the governor's mansion this fall, because we nominated somebody who's a little more to the right than most Republicans and Democrats are comfortable about. I think in the end, he took 44%, which was around 4% higher than I thought his top number was. I thought his top number was 40%. I think there was some concern that he's clearly not even a populist among Republicans, but in the crowded field, in an undisciplined field that was created by a lack of leadership from the state party. It's been a long time since we've had a strong state party, almost a generation. And when that happens, you have the 8 or 9 candidates that started and the 7 or 8 that finished. And when you cut the pie that many ways, you end up sometimes with a candidate that gives you some pause in the fall. Not that he can't win. Josh Shapiro is vulnerable. Josh Shapiro has his own problems and barely won an office that no one lost re-election to in the history of Pennsylvania a couple of years ago for attorney general. So there's still a race here, but clearly there is some concern that we went a little too far right, just as the Democrats, my colleagues on the Democratic side here, have to have a concern that you folks went probably a little too far left with John Fetterman. So we're both faced with some challenges for the fall in the 2 statewide races of consequence.
Yes, Keith, you talked about the state GOP and the inability to clear that field. I agree with you. I think that was a significant factor. I mean, they didn't do enough, and I think 10 years ago when Chairman Gleason was there, and it was a little bit of a different structure than it is now, that may have been avoided. It was obvious to all of us watching this that the leadership of the GOP did not want Mastriano. I saw text messages and tweets from our friend GOP Chairman Sam DeMarco here in Allegheny County, just urging the base not to vote for this man, talking about the internal polling, reflecting that he would not be the best candidate to win in November, doing what a leader of any party needs to do in a situation like this, which is think like a coach. You've got to put the best person on the field to win in the fall. And I would submit that the GOP did not do that with Mr. Mastriano. So not only do we have the statements and the actions of Mr. Mastriano over his career in this primary, which are very troubling and should be very troubling to anyone, but we also now have narratives from leadership in the Republican Party, ringing the alarm bells about this candidate and giving specific reasons why he should not be the nominee. So not only will we have the points that we would have, our playbook, but we're going to have narrative and speaking points from leaders of the Republican Party, including party chairman, to use to support our narrative that Josh Shapiro is the best choice for the Commonwealth.
Jim, you're saying it's going to be an easy victory for Shapiro in the fall?
No. Shapiro, we wanted to see Mastriano. It is very difficult to go against these trends that we're seeing. There's a couple of them. The Democrats have had the governor's mansion for 2 consecutive terms. I don't recall where either party has had the Pennsylvania governor's mansion for 3 consecutive terms. So you've got that headwind to push against. You have the headwind of what looks like it's going to be a good November for the GOP nationally. We're in a midterm. Traditionally, the party without the White House does well. There's polling that suggests they're going to do very well. So you have that headwind. You have the headwind that Keith mentioned about Mr. Shapiro's turnout or his reelect for Attorney General. I think that is apples and oranges from what we're doing now, but it's a factor that you can't take your look away from. So no, it's not a slam dunk by any means, but we have the best candidate who cleared the field, who has historic fundraising totals in his coffers, which he did not have to spend in a primary. He has spent the last 2 years organizing the party to the extent that's even possible. Guess what? He's done it. So everybody's rowing in the same direction over here because of these headwinds. So what were the catalysts we needed to push back? We needed what we think is a vulnerable, poor selection from the GOP. We have that. We also have these national social issues with that leaked draft decision that are galvanizing our base, and we have the perfect candidate to carry the flag into November. So I think the advantage should be Democrats this fall, based on where we stand today. For the
Democrats got the candidate, the opponent they want in this upcoming gubernatorial race. But remember, we got the candidate we wanted back in 2016, or the opponent that we wanted back in 2016 when Hillary was running against Donald Trump. Sometimes you have to remind yourself not to take anything for granted, and you have to campaign hard no matter who your opponent is, because things can change quickly.
And let's face it, guys, we got the candidate we wanted in the United States Senate race. We both have some work to do between now and November, but I can tell you, everyone on this show right now will tell the listeners it's an eternity between now and November. So many things can happen. Any of these 4 candidates are viable to win the seat for the United States Senate or governor, the 4 that are left standing in the major parties. Clearly, there's a concern with Republicans. In my mind, Mr. Barletta, Mr. McSwain, and Mr. White were too similar. And if there was a strong party, the party that I grew up with, of 20, 25 years ago, when they ruled with an iron fist, it didn't matter how many started. When they saw something like this happen, they would have gotten people out of the race. Because I would suggest on a one-on-one matchup with Barletta, McSwain, or Mr. White, any of those would have won this nomination over Mastriano, but they couldn't get any of them out. And as a result, it got fractured. But again, it's an eternity between now and November. I think that there are some ways to go at Mr. Shapiro that can be effective. I'm not losing sight of the fact that this is a red wave year. To a degree, we feel like we might have, cost ourselves some momentum nominating somebody that's so far to the right. But let me tell you, if your problem is you're too far to the right, the alternative is to push your candidate to the left. And I can tell you, there's a narrative that exists to do that with Josh Shapiro. So you're going to see the airwaves filled with independent expenditures trying to push Mr. Shapiro even further left than he is at this time.
We will continue our discussion in just a moment on the governor's race and also the Democratic Senate primary race in just a moment. Welcome back to Around the Table with Stacy Smith. We're talking politics today, the day after the Pennsylvania primary. And let's move on to the Democratic senatorial primary. Fetterman just buried his competition. So, Joe, I'll start with you. What happened to Connor Lamb in this race?
I think it's an example of what I'd spoken about earlier. Fetterman campaigned earlier than anybody. I mean, he was on the air wide and deep very early in this campaign, and he defined himself. And once he did that, once he established who he is, it was really difficult to run against that image. He did it quite successfully. I thought they were very good ads. Now he opened himself up to some criticism in the fall, certainly with some of those ads, and we'll see how that goes. But I'd like to congratulate my friend Keith Schmidt, who's still. I was reminded in this race that he's still one of the smartest campaign strategists on the scene these days. He said a couple of months ago that on the Republican side, that the two rich guys who were beating on each other mercilessly would probably turn the voters off, and neither one of them would win. Well, he's still right. What happened was they beat themselves into a draw. And had they not been so vicious with each other, one of them, I think, would have clearly pulled ahead and won this race. But those were just brutal campaigns. And of course, with the emergence of a third candidate at some point, that sort of set these guys on a path where they are right now. We don't know who the winner is.
What I learned is cash is king. I mean, the fact is we were all dismayed over the fact that politics started in such an uproarious fashion in January, and we were all complaining that we were wanting to get back to NCIS, and there was yet another commercial we had to watch in January and February for the United States Senate. And there wasn't a coffee shop or a bar or a family gathering that I didn't hear people complain about that. But in the end, those are the two people left standing. Money does talk. And in the end, I think people's attitude was, well, one of these two are going to win, and I'm not going to waste my vote. So they rise to the top on the inevitability of what the people think the outcome would be. But McCormick, absolutely, when you look at the tens of millions of dollars, there was still a large advantage of the money spent by McCormick than Mr. Ross, maybe as much as $8 to $10 million more dollars spent by Mr. McCormick. So the differentiating factor here, you would have to say, would be the endorsement from the former president that made that even, and it looks like a little edge to Oz, enough that he may win a very narrow victory in the Keystone State.
The former president's endorsement was a factor. The former president's involvement is one of the reasons why the Democrats can't do victory laps on either of these. Mastriano was Trump's pick. Mr. Trump has done well in the 79 corridor. We expect to see some play from the former president on that campaign. And if Oz wins, I expect we will see him on that as well. The Trump effect, the Trump factor was definitely present in Pennsylvania here. Maybe not in a way that was expected in the senatorial. And I say that because Mr. Trump endorsed Oz. There was significant pushback from rank and file GOP on the president's endorsement there. Notice the flyers that McCormick sent out with pictures of him with President Trump and the kind words that Mr. Trump used to use when describing Mr. McCormick. It created an impression in the Republican voter that Trump was with McCormick. So there they are looking towards McCormick as an alternative to Oz because they didn't necessarily agree with that endorsement. Now, right up the middle comes Barnett, who says, I am a true conservative. And like Keith said, these two are just blasting each other. So there's no clear winner between these two. She gains momentum. She talks about being a conservative. She's saying the things that Trump says. She put herself in some positions that the Trump supporters, the MAGAs, love. So there she goes. And then what does she do in the last 4 days? She goes after Donald Trump because he did not endorse her. And she attacks the former president. All of a sudden, she went from somebody we thought was going to come through the middle. She fell right back. So I think McCormick's impression, or the impression he gave that he was the Trump guy with his mailers, was enough for GOP voters, in my opinion, to say he's the alternative to Oz because he's had a relationship with Trump. And now that Barnett has attacked our president, we're going to go with McCormick. It's one way to look at it.
Sometimes too, apparently contrary things can both be true. Trump will be able to claim some victories here if his picks prevail, and some of them have prevailed. But Democrats can also claim some victories if Trump's picks prevailed in the primary, because that doesn't always sell the same in the general. And so that's what they're hoping.
All right, we're going to take another quick. Go ahead, Keith. Go ahead.
No, I'm swinging back to the Democratic results. You know, there is a
Which is what we
storyline.
started this discussion about.
Swinging back to the subject matter at hand, when we started with the Democrats, you know, there has to be a storyline, or somebody's got to write the story about the meteoric rise and fall of Connor Lamb. I mean, he was an intimidating force, or seemingly was, just a couple years ago. But it reminds me in my lifetime of maybe the meteoric rise and then the leveling off for Harris Wofford. Harris Wofford took the Senate seat off of a two-term governor of Pennsylvania and an attorney general of the United States under two presidents, and beat him, I think, almost 2-1, Dick Thornburgh, and then lost a close race to us just a little over 2 years later to Rick Santorum when he left the Congress to run as a young upstart 36-year-old for the United States Senate. But in both cases, both when you're referring to Harris Wofford back in 92 and 94, and now Mr. Lamb in 2020 and 2022, it was more about a movement of the country. It's not necessarily a reflection on them, especially on the first race they won. We gave them a lot of credit, or we said, you know, to the winner goes the spoils, but there was more of a message being sent with that race. And there were bigger things at play, both in the race for the Senate in 1992 with Harris Wofford and in 2020 with Connor Lamb's win. So maybe that comes into the play why he then loses almost 2-1 to Mr. Fetterman. But it is something that has to be discussed, because everybody in politics, on both sides of the aisle, were worried about or concerned about how quickly the star power and the stock of Connor Lamb grew at such a young age. And now I'm not sure he has a path.
All right, we will continue our discussion on the Democratic and Republican primaries for the United States Senate in just a moment. Welcome back to another edition of Around the Table with Stacy Smith. We're talking politics. The day after the Pennsylvania primary, we've talked a lot about the the Republican race for the United States Senate, which is basically 1,400 votes separating Oz and McCormick, and Fetterman won the Democratic nomination for the U.S. Senate easily. So, Jim or Joe, I'll put this to you this way. Have you ever seen anybody sweep every single county in a primary like this one?
Professor, I don't recall. I'm not sure. Not off the top of my head, I don't recall.
Yeah, I don't recall off the top of my head, but if you'd give us a half hour, we could probably research
get the Google machine out or something like that. Yeah. Well, my point being that the strength that he showed, he has 59%, almost 60% of the Democratic primary voters voted for Fetterman. So how strong does that make him for the fall?
I think it helps a lot. I mean, I know that he is the candidate that the GOP wanted. Keith has alluded to that. We acknowledge that. But as we've talked about with respect to some of these Trump picks, you've got to be careful what you ask for sometimes. I like to call it the Marco Ramius approach. When Marco Ramius wrote that letter to the Soviet military saying, "I'm taking the Red October and going to America," he knew it would scare the hell out of his officers, and it was a live or die situation. So sometimes you got to put that adversary or that scare out there to galvanize your base in order to be successful. So now we have the candidates that are Trump picks on the GOP side. Good. Now we have to work harder, and we have to galvanize our base and work like our lives depended on it, because we're going to argue that the future of the Republic may very well depend on whether or not we win or lose in November. So we have our Marco Ramius moment. And with Fetterman, we can make that same argument here, irrespective of Oz or McCormick. We're going to be able to tie Donald Trump to both of them. McCormick has used him to say that he's loyal to Mr. Trump, whether or not Trump is with him or not. Oz was endorsed by him. So absolutely. So even though the GOP wanted someone they label as a progressive, John Fetterman has proven time and time again this spring with some of those issues we've talked about that they are Teflon to him. Very similar to how many issues we thought would take Trump out rolled right off of him. So he's got that Teflon. And as we've talked about, people in this state love the man, i.e. 67 county sweep. So he is going to be more formidable. And in a cycle where you have Trump candidates we are going to be able to take that approach where it's all hands on deck. You've got to come out like you did in 2020 for the future of the republic. So these are talking points we think will be effective moving into the fall.
I don't think the story about this Democratic Senate primary is really one about Connor Liam falling short. I think that John Fetterman is in a sense a novelty candidate, a candidate whose style appeals to regular folk. And to that extent, that style also appeals to some Trump supporters who, regardless of what his politics might be, they'll embrace his style. So I think that those people who won't warm to the big money candidate on the Republican side, even though they're Republicans, could very well be voting for John Fetterman as well. He's one of those candidates who just caught the wave. And when they come along, there's not much you can do about it. And it doesn't say anything about their opponent, because it's really about them catching that wave.
Keith,
Although I love and respect Joe Mystic, and he's one of the most brilliant political analysts of my lifetime.
Here it comes.
I'm not going to buy that there's Trump people going to support Fetterman. I mean, that is the biggest stretch of all. I mean, he's going to be competitive. I can tell you, we have to take Fetterman seriously, but not as it relates to Trump supporters. I don't think he's going to get any Trump supporters, but Fetterman is a very able fundraiser. And we're not going to have, at least on candidate to candidate, a fundraising advantage in the fall. And that's a big deal, because earlier in the show, I said money's king. So it's going to come down to, in my opinion, whether the Democratic Senatorial National Committee values Pennsylvania, because I know for a fact the Republican National Senatorial Committee is going to put money into our candidate. And if the Democrats look at this and say it's worth investing in and can keep him competitive, this could be more of a race than we want it to be. I still believe it's a safe win, but I really think it's going to come down to whether the National Democratic Senatorial Committee decides to fund Fetterman in Pennsylvania.
Bringing that up-
Keith, now, Keith, if you won't buy Trump supporters, how about Republicans who are a little antsy about Trump?
Sure. Okay. All right.
A lot of
All right.
those.
Huh? Okay.
Is this a negotiation? I'll acquiesce, Your Honor.
Well, I want to
middle ground.
in about a minute here, if someone can talk about this, the fact that the National Democratic Senatorial Committee chose not to throw any money at Connor Lamb and support him in this.
Sure, I'd like to speak on that, because they did that 6 years ago. You had Washington money come up here and take out Joe Sestak against Katie McGinney. They took out the progressive and they spent a lot of money. Sestak was winning, and all of a sudden millions come into Katie McGinney. Money that could have been used to defeat Pat Toomey in the fall was spent on an inter-party squabble. So they shot themselves in the foot. That was one of the races they shot themselves in the foot that year. So I think they learned from their mistake, number one. And number two, they learned from their mistake. Don't interfere. Let it happen. Let's see where we go. So you have a progressive frontrunner in John Fetterman against more moderate / establishment in Connor Lamb. We didn't see them do what they did with Katie. That's one of the reasons. They knew they made a mistake 6 years ago. And they also are cognizant of the fact that the Progressive Party continues, the progressive wing continues to gain momentum in the party. And they continue to log victory after victory. Not all, but they're getting more gains. So they knew to step back and not do that for those two reasons. And they stayed away from the Summerlee-Irwin race because for the same reasons. Now, a lot of AIPAC money came in, millions, to help Steve Irwin. And obviously it didn't make a difference. And I would submit that if they tried to interfere in that race, the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, Summerlee would still be with her margin that we see now ahead. And I don't think there's enough votes to catch Summerlee in the 12th.
We will talk about the 12th Congressional District and also where politics stand for both parties right now when Around the Table with Stacy Smith continues. Welcome back to Around the Table with Stacy Smith. We're talking politics, the Pennsylvania primary. Let's talk about the 12th Congressional District. The Republicans have one candidate, Mike Doyle, not the same Mike Doyle who decided not to run again, but we do have, it's basically a lock for the Democrats to win this race. I think nobody's going to disagree with that. So it's Fetterman, I mean, it's Summerlee against Steve Irwin. There are 446 votes that separate the two of those. Is there enough in a recount for Irwin to overcome those 446 votes?
I
Yeah,
don't
I've been
believe
involved
so.
in these kinds of cases. It's, either the votes are there or they are not. I mean, and you have to do an analysis of what's still outstanding and then try to figure out what the break might be by comparing it to other parts of the district. And then you'll know whether or not you're even in striking distance. It's very difficult to find that many votes this late in the game. Not impossible, it's happened, but difficult.
It's more than likely that I think it's almost an inevitability that Summer Lee will be the nominee. I agree with the professor. It was interesting to watch the dynamic of this race. I don't think there are enough votes based on if there's an automatic recount. I don't know. I don't suspect based on today's technology and process and intricate analysis and counting of the ballots that you're going to find any major discrepancies. I don't think that what's outstanding breaks strong one way or the other. I suspect that those that remain to be counted are going to follow these margins. From what I understand, most of those that remain to be counted are not in Westmoreland County, where Steve Irwin was winning 2-3 to 1. They're in Allegheny, where Summer Lee on same day voting was beating Steve Irwin convincingly. He got out ahead early on those numbers we watched last night because of mail-in ballots. And that's part of that organization and that money he had to do mail-in balloting. But never underestimate retail. Summer Lee has been on the ground since last August. That retail paid off because people who showed up on the day of election, the margins went for her. So what am I saying? At the end of the day, like what Joe said, Summer wins.
I would make the argument that this is going to be the first substantive win for the progressive movement in southwestern Pennsylvania. In that, I understood they won judge races. I understood they run some DJ races and whatnot and turned out people in a very impressive fashion. But this was a policy-driven race. This was running as a progressive. This was bringing Bernie Sanders in and endorsing her in a very public way. This was saying, I'm a proud progressive. This is the direction we need to go. And it looks like she's going to be their nominee and then eventually hold that seat in Congress. So this is a very important moment for the progressive movement in southwestern Pennsylvania.
I want to move on and similar to what Keith is saying here. What statement is this making about politics of who won and where the Pennsylvania voter stands? Fetterman won easily. He's considered a progressive. Summer Lee holds the lead in the 12th on the GOP side. Mastriano, supported by Trump, wins. Oz, endorsed by Trump, apparently has the lead right now. Where does this put the voter in Pennsylvania?
They're going in different directions. And I would submit to Keith that Summer Lee and Sarah Innamorato, who took out two of the Costa brothers, Costas, established state representatives in 2018, not even close. Those were significant wins for the progressive movement. These judges, you can't underestimate what happened with the judges in Allegheny County. So this was the biggest, absolutely. This was United States Congress, biggest win. But there have been some wins leading up to this that would suggest that there is a trend. But I think it speaks to answer your question, Stacy, of voters tired of the same talking points, the same names, the same faces, the same people coming that have been there, anti-incumbent fervor. They're not happy with their lot in life. They're tired of the same empty promises. And people coming out from the establishment wing of the party, maybe the same person or somebody from that demographic. Oh, well, I'm the guy or I'm the gal to help you. It's just not resonating. And the lack of party organization at the county and currently the state levels also is a narrative. There's not that infrastructure or that process that there used to be to get non-electable candidates out early and get candidates up sooner. So it's a combination of those things.
Let's not forget Ed Gainey. Ed Gainey was a very successful progressive campaign. It was managed and driven by the SEIU. It was driven by Democratic Socialists. It was a big win for that movement. Now, as far as the Summer Lee race goes, it just shows you things are right now in the balance. And we're not sure which way the scales will eventually tip because it's still a dead heat. But our party, the Democratic Party, just like the Republican Party, are both at crossroads. And we'll see whether we go back to the old way of doing things or whether we move forward.
Keith, you got 15 seconds to wrap it up.
No, in races like Southwestern Pennsylvania urban races, being a progressive doesn't hurt in the fall, obviously, but both parties have to be worried about going too far left or too far right in a state that's very purple.
All right, gentlemen, thank you. Sorry again that we lost Governor Corbett. He'll join us again the next time we have Around the Table with Stacy Smith. I want to thank you also for watching, and we hope that you join us again for Around the Table with Stacy Smith. Thanks for joining us.